The cold rain lashes on this Congolese man's face as he hacks at the rubber vine. The white liquid that slowly flows from the wounded vines gathers in his bucket, conscripted into harvesting the wild rubber as his way of paying his tax that fed King Leopold's greedy colonial machine. Around him, his counterparts worked in the wet jungle, their faces showing fear of the rubber quotas they had to meet to avoid harsh punishment, destroying their ancestral forests to satisfy his colonial overseers' endless greed. In the winter of 1884, the Prussian capital of Berlin was cold, but inside the luxurious Reichskanzler Palace, the ambitions of European leaders were burning hot. Chancellor Otto von Bismarck had called the great powers of Europe together to decide how they would divide the African continent in the coming decades. One by one, the delegations from Britain, France, Belgium, Spain, Portugal, Italy, the Netherlands, and others arrived. They all came at Bismarck's request, each with the singular intent of solidifying their nation's claims over the vastnesses of the African territory. The young United States was the only country that didn't attend, staying true to its republican values and avoiding colonial ambitions overseas. But perhaps the greatest insult was the utter exclusion of any African who weren't invited to this crucial meeting that would shape their continent's future. No voices would speak for the countless ethnic societies, kingdoms, or fledgling nations that had indigenously inhabited this land for millennia. The European powers would decide the fate of their ancestral lands without any input from the indigenous people. As Bismarck's gavel hammered open the proceedings, a veneer of noble rhetoric about promoting free trade, religious missions, and ending the slave trade cloaked the rapacious designs underlying the hasty parleys. With borderlines ultimately drawn based on heavily skewed European cartography, the Great Scramble accelerated to hasten the conquest of the continent's boundless riches in natural resources, land, and exploitable native populations. The conference's cynical rules stated that any European claim would only be recognized through either a show of military force, often just an isolated coastal outpost or two, or exploiting the difference of culture concept of land ownership by tricking local indigenous rulers into signing treaties that ceded their lands. Whole societies found their territories suddenly divided, while rulers were fooled into giving up control over ancestral lands through unclear and dishonestly translated treaty terms. Perhaps no European power was as successful as the unassuming constitutional monarch of Belgium, King Leopold II. Through clever politics and fake humanitarianism, Leopold secured a huge personal landholding, the vast, resource-rich Congo basin of Central Africa. Paying mere lip service about establishing a free trade zone open to all Europeans, the king secretly saw these new territorial lines not as outlining a colonial holding for Belgium itself, but as marking his own property to exploit as he wished. To Leopold, the millions of indigenous people unlucky enough to live within this 900,000 square mile area were now his personal subjects to dominate and profit from. Almost immediately, the Congo's lush interior fell under the harsh control of Leopold's Force Publique mercenaries. Any idea of free trade vanished as a corrupt regime of pure exploitation took hold. Lucrative rubber trees and other natural resources were forcibly taken, their harvesting fueling a brutally violent system of slavery and deadly quotas enforced on the indigenous populations at gunpoint. Laborers who failed to meet the impossible rubber demands had their villages burned, wives imprisoned, children taken as hostages, and bodies mutilated or killed outright, all to ensure a steady flow of wealth back to Leopold's personal coffers in Brussels. Starvation, disease, and mass death became normal in this humanitarian disaster. In service to the rubber boom, vast infrastructure projects like the Congo River railways were quickly built through the jungle, using a system of forced labor and indiscriminate brutality. Indigenous workers often had limbs cut off or endured other torturous punishments for perceived underperformance by their mercenary overseers. The goal was always to streamline resource extraction to maximize profits at any human cost. Within Leopold's corrupt Congo territory, human life itself became expendable, just like rubber and ivory tusks. As the 20th century began, the extent of the crimes against humanity in Leopold's Congo could no longer be hidden. Reports and first-hand accounts of the Force Public's savage atrocities started to reach the wider world, breaking through the censorship. Photographs emerged showing the horrific merchandising of severed human hands from Congolese rubber harvesters who failed to meet their brutal quotas. Pushed by humanitarians and journalistic exposés, the international community could no longer ignore this nightmare of colonial brutality. As the death toll from famine, disease, dismemberment, and unchecked cruelty rose into the millions, potentially as many as 15 million Congolese by 1908, the outcry over Leopold's atrocities grew louder. The so-called Great Civilizing Mission had turned into industrialized racial genocide. With his supposed commitment to free trade, now a grotesque joke, Leopold was finally forced by domestic pressure and foreign outrage to give up his personal colony back to the Belgian state in 1908. But even under Belgian parliamentary rule, little was done to fundamentally change the system of exploitation established during the king's cruel reign. Many of the same mercenaries, overseers, and profiteering systems remained, from the military garrisons and predatory concession companies to the forced labor and rubber quotas themselves. While some of the worst physical atrocities and mutilations decreased, the prevailing mindset continued to be one of ruthless resource extraction by any means necessary. Unlike other colonies, where educational and health institutions were established, the Belgian Congo was only a resource farm. Such institutions were virtually non-existent. The racist ideological framework that was crucial in dehumanizing the indigenous population and justifying the crimes of the previous regime remained rotten but intact. The idea of the civilizing force of Belgian colonialism being worth any human cost continued as a convenient fiction. Though the individual sadist Leopold was gone, his greedy hunger remained institutionalized. The Congo continued to be ruthlessly exploited at gunpoint to meet the colonial machine's demands for maximum profit at minimum cost. The same exploitation and abuse that had added insult to injury for millions of victims during the prior 2 decades of darkness persisted. The scars of his brutal reign left a lasting mark on the Congo. The world's outrage eventually led to some changes, but the deep-rooted systems of exploitation and oppression continued to plague the region for many years.